Trump thinks he's so important and powerful that Putin would never dare to break his word to Trump.
It's where we're going to start as well, the diplomatic scramble to rescue support for Ukraine after the car crash White House visit on Friday. The Times is reporting that Germany's next Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, has called the row between Volodymyr Zelensky, J.D. Vance and Donald Trump a manufactured escalation by the Americans. Other European leaders have been quick to show solidarity with Zelensky and Ukraine, including at the weekend summit here in London at Lancaster House. Keir Starmer is invited to a meeting of EU leaders on Thursday to discuss next steps, including a potential ceasefire. We can talk about all of this with Steven Erlanger, who's the Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. Steven, a very good afternoon from London. First up, there are reports that Donald Trump will discuss cancelling all military aid to Ukraine soon. He's posted on Truth Social just in the last hour or so that tomorrow night is going to be big. This is where he addresses both houses in the American legislature. What more do you know about that?
Well, we've had a briefing in the Pentagon and from the White House, unnamed sources as ever, but briefing, not just us, suggesting that President Trump is so annoyed with Zelensky and is convinced himself that Zelensky is refusing an immediate ceasefire because he thinks he has the United States on its side, that he's considering stopping arms shipments. Now, these are arms shipments that were bought and paid for under Joe Biden's last big $61 billion tranche. They're in the pipeline. To stop them now, I think, would be an important and rather ugly symbolic gesture. I don't know if they stopped, how long they would stop, but it does make the European effort to continue military supplies to Ukraine as urgent as it was before, if not more urgent.
Do you think that Sir Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, has got enough clout and momentum from what a lot of people thought was a very decent meeting with President Trump to be a big broker in all of this?
Well, we need a big broker. We need a couple of them. I think working with Mark Rutte, who's the Secretary General of NATO, someone who Trump also gets on with, that can help. And also Giorgia Meloni, Trump likes her, Prime Minister of Italy. So I think if they cobble it together and have a fairly united front, I think it really will have an impact. But it is important that people take the lead. Macron started, but Keir Starmer's picked it up nicely. And of course, in Brussels itself, you have Mark Rutte, but also Antonio Costa and Ursula von der Leyen. So I think the whole point is to get a united front more than it is to single out a particular leader, because there isn't a particular leader.
So if what we were talking about initially does happen and Donald Trump says, right, we're stopping this particular parcel of aid, I know it's more than that, then what should the reaction be from those leaders in Europe? Are we at the point where they just have to carry on saying, OK, President Trump, you carry on doing whatever you're doing. We're literally in a breakout meeting over here deciding something for ourselves?
Well, I think they do need to keep up military aid, which they promised to do. I don't think even Trump wants Ukraine to collapse on his watch. It would be an ugly stain on his presidency. I think he wants to force Ukraine and Russia into a deal, into a ceasefire. The main difference is he thinks there should be a ceasefire right away, and he would trust Putin to keep this ceasefire, while Ukraine and the Europeans think a ceasefire is okay, but want guarantees or at least some kind of better security assurances before they go into a ceasefire, because they don't trust Putin to keep it. I think that's the main distinction, which is this distrust of Vladimir Putin on Zelensky European side, and this amazing trusting of Putin on Trump's side, because Trump thinks he's so important and powerful that Putin would never dare to break his word to Trump.
And what happens in Europe, Stephen, if the coalition of the willing turns out to be really quite small?
Well, I think it's early days yet, to be honest. I mean, because we don't know, first of all, if there's a ceasefire, we don't know what kind of peace deal there may be. We don't know if the Russians would even, as part of a deal, allow European troops to be on the ground in Ukraine. At the moment, they say no, but that's their opening bargaining position. We don't know whether the force would be a monitoring force or a tripwire force. We don't know how big it would be. We don't know who would command it. So I think there's a really long way to go. I mean, I think one could put together 20 to 30,000 European troops in the right circumstances to make sure that a deal actually lasts. But we're pretty far away from that, I have to say. There's a lot of talking left to do before that.
Sure. President Zelensky says his difficulties with the US will pass. How do you see that happening?
Well, I hope they pass. I think Trump bears grudges. He's borne a grudge against Zelensky ever since his first term in office, Trump's first term, when Trump was impeached unsuccessfully, wasn't convicted, but impeached because he was pushing Zelensky to investigate Hunter Biden, President Biden's son, and Zelensky refused. And so Trump's been angry with Zelensky ever since. I think Trump's also bought the Putin narrative somehow that Ukraine kind of belongs to the Russian world, to the Ruski Mir, Russian civilization, and is a kind of semi-state. And I think Trump wants Ukraine out of the way because I think he has in mind, I don't know what exactly, but having great deals with his pal VV Putin. So I think he sees Ukraine as kind of an obstacle and wants the killing to stop, certainly, but also wants it off the table. So I think, you know, Zelensky and he are condemned in the end to work something out, but it's not going to be pleasant.
Zelensky has said, hasn't he, and this was in regard to Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, that he would be prepared to stand aside to not be President Zelensky. Would that make any difference to Trump, given exactly that nature of the kind of possible vendetta that President Trump might have with him personally?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, Lindsey Graham, whose spine moves with the wind, depending on Trump, said the other day he thought Zelensky should resign to restore relations with the United States. But that's not going to happen. Ukrainians may not like Zelensky, not all of them, but they do support him, and they are in wartime, and there won't be an election. And when Zelensky says he'd resign to have a NATO membership, I mean, that's a fantasy. I'm not sure if he'd be willing to resign just to make Trump feel better.
Good to talk to you. Steven Erlanger is the Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times.